Let's talk butterfly swords. What's a butterfly sword? This is a Chinese butterfly sword. It has a couple of distinguishing features. The most notable feature is probably this D-shaped guard. See how that looks like a capital D? It's got a handle, it's got a blade. Typically, a butterfly sword had to be a pair of half-handled swords. So you take two half-handled swords, put them in a single hand. They look like a single sword. There were also singular knives that looked like that. They would have a single full handle, so you take that half handle and round it all the way around. They would commonly be used with a shield, so you'd have sword and shield. So what's sword and shield? There's your shield, there's your sword. That was historically not considered a butterfly sword, but there's a strong preference for comfortable handles today. Martial artists like practicing with sensible weapons, and there's no question that today a pair of full-handled swords that look like that are indeed butterfly swords. The Chinese for butterfly sword is hudi dao, and dao means knife. And to the Chinese, a bladed weapon that had a cutting edge on one side and was not sharp on the other side, that was a knife. So these are big knives. Hudi dao include butterfly swords and butterfly knives. Wu dip dao means butterfly sword. Bat jam do, various other names used by the Wing Chun folks, those mean butterfly knife. Usually the Wing Chun people call their weapons, which tend to be a bit shorter. This is Wing Chun length. This is warrior length. The shorter weapons are what the Wing Chun people usually use, but not entirely. In any event, the Wing Chun people like to call theirs butterfly knives. Now let me take a moment and talk to you about the parts of a butterfly sword. You've got the blade, this casting right here that looks like the letter D is called the D guard. The end of the sword, that's called the butt. This area here that my hand grips, that's called the grip. It's the handle. In this case, you can see the tang. It runs all the way through the handle quite visibly. This ground out area, this bevel here, that's the grind. There can be more than one grind on a particular blade. In fact, this Sasquatch style butterfly sword has a compound grind. It's got a hollow grind up top and a flat grind there. The top of the blade that's not sharpened on this dao is the spine. The bottom of the blade, the sharp edge of the blade, that's the cutting edge. In this case, it's a 1 millimeter blunt, or my finger would have come back red from that rush. This is the point. And that's pretty much it, except for the fuller. The fuller is this groove that runs through the side of the blade. You can have a fuller on one side, you can have a fuller on both sides, or you can have no fuller. Most Chinese butterfly swords just plain didn't need a fuller. If you look at this warrior antique, you won't see any fuller, and you won't see it on most antiques. The purpose of a fuller is to take weight off the blade, maintain the same level of structural integrity at a lower weight, just like an I-beam. It will also promote a target bleeding out, but that's not the primary purpose. This happens to be a functional fuller. When I did the integral swords, the integral knives, they had a fuller on one side, and it was a very functional fuller. It's nice, deep. It took a lot of work to do. It's difficult to grind a fuller out so that it looks good, so that it's deep, and then polish the inside of that deep groove. Your typical modern butterfly sword, even if it costs a couple $100, is going to have a decorative fuller. It's not going to be very deep, so it doesn't take any weight off, doesn't promote bleeding out. It's not a real fuller. And it's particularly bad if the fuller runs here into this D guard, because that groove runs underneath this casting, and it's a channel for things that are going to cause rust into an area where you can't do anything to prevent it. Now let's talk practice. When you practice with martial arts weapons, don't practice with sharp weapons. Butterfly swords can maim, they can do lethal damage. The warrior butterfly swords were certainly designed to do lethal damage. And now let's talk about blunts. What's your typical blunt butterfly sword look like? Well, unfortunately, it looks a lot like these. This is your standard low-end butterfly sword. It's a piece of steel that is a flat sheet. An astonishing 1 millimeter thick, and all they did was cookie cutter this out of a piece of flat sheet steel. Let me show you some other modern examples of low quality knives. This one's probably it's a good 3 millimeters. Once again, they cookie cutter. They didn't do any grinding, low end work. Let's take a look at these. That was scary. Alright, that looks to be about two millimeter thick sheet steel, cookie cuttered. I don't think anyone made any kind of effort whatsoever beyond stamping the die down on the sheet. Those were all under 150, two of them were under $100. This happens to be a pretty nice training sword. It's from Crane's Productions. It is about 3.5 millimeters thick. Once again, they did a cookie cutter move. They didn't do any fancy grinding on the edge, but they did sort of smooth off the corner of this cutting edge. I probably would have rounded it, but you can't have everything. When we make or design or spec out a butterfly sword for everything Wing Chun or for Model Design LLC, we usually ask for a 1 millimeter blunt edge. And this particular knife, which probably looks pretty sharp to you, that's got one of our 1 millimeter blunt edges. That's a blunt. Looks sharp, but is blunt.